So, welcome back. We are going to be talking about chapter 6 now, which is theater in the 1800s. Let me share my screen with you guys. Okay, chapter 6, melodrama and romanticism. So, 18th century had some different kinds of drama. They had irregular forms of drama, drama that did not follow the neoclassical rules of time, space, and action, as you may recall. There was in England, there was something that was called the ballad opera. So these are things that happened in the 1700s, which is the 18th century, that didn't exactly follow all the neoclassical rules. And the ballad opera came about in England, and it was words that were meant to be spoken, but they were put to the tunes of popular ballads and popular music. And so they call it a ballad opera. So the words were actually meant to be said, but they sang them. So kind of like it's kind of the predecessor maybe to the American musical. And we'll talk about that next time. Okay, there was the opera comique. So we had comic opera. And Carmen is considered a comic opera. It has comic elements to it, but it's actually a tragedy. So, but they called it the comic opera or opera comique in France. And then there was Singspiel in Germany. Yes, it literally translates to sing speak. And one of the famous examples of this was Mozart's The Magic Flute. So we had different drama, not just the five acts and the neoclassical rules, and or even the Commedia dell'arte, which didn't have any of those rules, but then they tried to put rules onto it. But basically, there were other forms of drama that were out there as well. Oh, and England had something called pantomime, and they actually still have this today, and it doesn't have anything to do with, mime. So it's a different kind of a thing. It has stock characters. People cheer when certain characters come out and boo when other characters come out. And my understanding, it's a comedy and it's a real good time. So they were able to transform places and things. Okay, then we get into romanticism. And so the idea of romanticism came about. The whole philosophy was that God created the universe out of himself so that he may contemplate himself. He wants to look at himself and think about himself. And we are made in his image, so we should go ahead and show ourselves off to each other. That's the whole idea of the romantic notion. So here's the difference between neoclassicism and romanticism. So neoclassicism favors socially accepted norms, right? Everybody was supposed to stay in their lane. If you were clergy, you needed to act like clergy. If you were a noble, you needed to act like a noble. And if you were a servant, you needed to act like a servant. And that was it. And those were the socially accepted norms. In romanticism, it kind of favors the nature and its particular manifestations. So if people are different, that is kind of shown and glorified. A good example of romanticism is The Hunchback of Notre Dame, right? The book, the original story, not the cartoon, although it's taken from there. But the fact that you can find beauty in different kinds of people, and this is how nature made people. And so the romanticism isn't always happy, but it tugs at your heart in some way. Neoclassicism, the supernatural elements in drama were frowned upon because remember, we had unity of time, unity of place, unity of action, and we didn't want anything supernatural to go on because that's improbable and that's fantasy and it has nothing to do with reason. Romanticism, we have mystical and supernatural elements. They are embraced as aspects of existence beyond the confines of rationality. We don't know why magic works, but it just works. That's the romantic view. Neoclassicism, the characters behaved rather according to their socially accepted norms pertaining to age, social status, occupation, ethnicity, and gender. Again, women behaved like women, and they didn't do things men would do. You wouldn't find a female, you know, ditch digger or something like that. Again, in neoclassicism, you stayed in your lane. In Romanticism, characters frequently behave differently or defiantly of socially accepted norms, and the leading characters often possess opposing qualities. So there is the prostitute with a heart of gold, right? So we're looking at things that may be improbable, but probably exist in nature. In neoclassicism, we looked at the unities of time, place, and action, and those were followed. And in Romanticism, the unities of time, place, and action are not followed. You could have, 10 years between the beginning of the play and the end of the play, or 40, So all of that stuff was thrown out the window. Neoclassicism, you had generic scenery. We had some fantastical scenery, the things that came on and off and the whole perspective things, but still any play that took place in a forest, it took place in this forest because that's the only set pieces that we have for the forest. They were hard to build, a whole lot of them here. And any of them that took place in a palace, no matter what the story was, took place in this palace. So it was kind of generic, the scenery and the costumes were usually, well, in many of the cases, they just wore their own clothes. So they didn't have specific costumes for the characters. They might for one or the other, especially some of the men who played women's roles. Obviously, they had some costumes and stuff, but it wasn't really particular to that character. In Romanticism, now we do. Now we have particular scenery and costumes. If you're on a beach in, and it's a rocky beach, that's different than the beach that's a sandy beach. And we can build backdrops for two different beaches. So the scenery was very particular. And so were the costumes. They were specific to the character and what was going on. And it often detailed real life locations. And the costumes were beginning to really individualize the characters. So these are the differences between neoclassicism and Romanticism. Okay, so Shakespeare throughout Europe. Shakespeare was not performed in any other country than England until the late 18th century. Remember when I told you that Racine's plays, the French plays were considered the great masters of the time, and they really didn't do anything with Shakespeare's plays. They considered him barbarous because he defied the neoclassical rules. He mostly had 5 acts, but other than that, no, there were lots of subplots. There were things that happened, certainly not within 24 hours, days and weeks and years away from each other. So we didn't like him. The rest of Europe just kind of turned up their nose at him and didn't really appreciate him. And some of his plays, they liked the concepts, but they rewrote them to help them conform to the rules. Different people did that. But by the 19th century, he was lauded as a genius. And then the standard by which all plays were judged throughout all of Europe were now Shakespeare. So things happen, you just got to wait a century. Okay. In the 19th century, so the 1800s, right, the most popular dramatic form was called the melodrama. Now, a lot of times we think of melodramas now as comic, but they weren't really comic. We think of them with big stock characters like the villain and the heroine and the hero. And they were that, and they were cheered and they were booed, but it wasn't necessarily for comic effect. There were very clear, very suspenseful plots. The characters were put in danger and had to be saved. A villain would hound a virtuous protagonist, somebody who was virtuous, and some villain would come and try to mess him up. And this protagonist overcame seemingly unsurmountable difficulties after undergoing a series of threats to life, reputation, or happiness. This was the plot of most melodramas. There was at least one elaborate, spectacular happening in all of the melodramas. There was an earthquake, there was a burning building, there was an explosion. It had a lot of technical scenery, big spectacle things that happened with it. Or it would have a scene of local color. There was a festival or a dance, and but things that involved a lot of scenery and a lot of spectacle happened during melodramas. Typical plots included mistaken identity. Oh, I thought you were somebody else. Abductions, there were kidnappings, strange coincidences, and hidden documents. So there were, oh, we look what we found here. Wait, this is the deed to the old homestead. Oh, we're saved now. Things like that. Evil people were always, always punished, and good were always, always rewarded. In melodrama, there was no iffiness. It was very cut and dry. There was a hero and there was a villain. And there may be some other supporting characters, but either they were on the side of good or they were on the side of evil. It was just very straightforward about that. I would like you to look at the crash course, number 29 on the melodrama. I don't want to take the time to show it here, but I will include it in your module there because it's very informative. Okay, music and machines in melodrama. Like I said, there was a lot of spectacle. So melodrama literally means music drama. So while the action was going on, usually there was somebody playing piano because it's a live theater piece, right? On the stage, either on the stage with them or, on the side or in the orchestra pit or somewhere, but there's usually music going on. And it was kind of music that scored what was happening on stage. So exciting times and people are chasing each other around. And slow and romantic, or oh, something bad's about to happen, kind of like what we do in movies and television now. So as well as songs, all acting was underscored by music. Like I just said, there was music playing throughout the entire show, whether it be happy music or sad music. It let the audience know how they should be feeling. Again, much like what most of the shows and dramas and things we have now are. Electricity in melodrama. So this is the birth of electricity. Electric motors were, electricity was discovered, and now we use electric motors with treadmills to stage horse or chariot races on stage. Remember I told you they had big spectacles? Yeah, this is taking place on stage. I can't even imagine them bringing a horse onto a stage right now, much less having all these mechanical things built in so the horses could actually run on these treadmills and we could simulate a horse race on the stage or a chariot race. Those are even bigger, right? So, but this was a genre of melodrama that actually existed. They had panoramas, which were big, long cloths where there was a continuous scene. So as people are walking or as the horses are running, they have, a piece of paper. I'm trying to find a piece of paper. So they have this scene going on, and as this part's rolling up, this part's unrolling over here so that the scene just looks like it keeps going on and on and on. We do this electronically now, right? But they had actual scenery. So the scenery kept moving around these spools to look like the people were walking along the street or whatever. So they were suspended at the rear of the stage and they pulled along to synchronize with the treadmills so that it would look like the horses were, like it was going this way. So the horses were running and the track was going past them and things like that. Under the Gaslight. Um, this is the first of many, many plays and different things that actually tied a character to the railroad tracks, you know, in imminent danger of destruction by this oncoming locomotive. You've probably seen commercials and things like that, but you can't get out of the way fast enough from a moving train. A moving train can't see you and stop. It's got so much weight behind it. It takes, a mile or so before it can stop, even when it slams on the brakes. So if you're in the middle of the track, you just get squashed. So this villain tied this person to the railroad tracks, and someone comes and saves him at the last minute. But this was the melodrama Under the Gaslight was the first show that ever did this, and then there have been copycats ever since. Monte Cristo, and no, not the sandwich. This is a play. Alex Dumas wrote a novel called The Count of Monte Cristo. And he attempted to make it into a play called Monte Cristo, but at the time it was 20 acts long and required 2 evenings to perform it. And that's a really long play. And European and American audiences don't sit for things like that. There are some plays like that that exist in Asian countries, but we are not that patient. And it was just a little bit too long. So several other people rewrote it, but Charles Fetcher, a French actor, wrote the one that's most performed in 19 I don't know what I was doing in 1885. James O'Neill, who was an actor, purchased the rights and made other revisions. James O'Neill was an actor, and he was the star of the show. And as the star of the show, he took this particular script, made some revisions to it, made it his own, and then proceeded to perform it pretty much for the rest of his life. So the plot of Monte Cristo is that we have a hero named Edmond Dumas. And yeah, Alexandre Dumas is the one that wrote it. So yeah, whatever. Okay. But Edmond, he returns from wherever he is. I think he was in France, and he returns to marry his fiancée, Mercedes. There are 3 villains in this show. The first is Danglars, and Mr. Danglars is the ship's cargo officer. And then there's Fernand, who loves Mercedes. And then there's Villefort. So Villefort is in fear of Dumas bringing a letter back that ruins his career. So Edmond is coming back, and he has a letter that, if given to the right people, will ruin Villefort's career. Danglars is the ship's cargo officer, and I believe he's a friend of Villefort's, and he lets him know that Dumas is coming back. So these 3 guys basically arrange for his arrest when he gets off the boat. They put him in prison, and they put him on an island. It's a penal island, which basically means it's an island that the only reason it exists is because it's a prison. Chateau d'If, for 14 years. So he's stuck in this prison for 14 years on this island. While he's in prison, he meets another prisoner, Faria. And Faria tells him that he has a family fortune, and it's on the island of Monte Cristo. And Faria is old. Faria is going to die. Faria doesn't think he's ever going to leave the island, and he certainly doesn't think Edmond is ever going to leave the island. So he tells him exactly where the fortune is buried on this island. Well, Faria dies, and Edmond gets into the sack that they had put Faria in. He takes the dead body out and kind of hides it. Then he gets into the sack. And so they're going to throw the dead guy into the sea, and they throw Edmond into the sea, and he's alive. And this is how he escapes from prison. He gets out, gets picked up by a boat or something like that. He gets to the island of Monte Cristo, finds the fortune. There's no other people to inherit it. There were no other relatives. So he becomes the Count of Monte Cristo. So he becomes the Count of Monte Cristo. And then he finds each of the villains who put him in prison and vanquishes them one by one. And at the end, they are all either publicly disgraced or they're dead. And he discovers Albert, who he believes is Ferdinand's son. And he's arranging a duel to kill Albert because he thinks he's Ferdinand's son, who ended up marrying Mercedes after Edmund was put away for 14 years. And he realizes, or he finds out, that he wasn't Ferdinand's son, that Mercedes was actually pregnant with Edmund's baby, and Edmund didn't know it. And Albert is actually his own son. And so at the duel, when he realizes that this is his son, he actually abandons the murderous plan and he lets Albert kill him instead. So again, romanticism, giving up something for a noble cause. Albert, kills him after he's publicly disgraced what he thinks is his father. But, Albert gets to live and Albert is his son. All right, James O'Neill, this actor who played Edmund. He has a famous line that as he's in the sack, he's in the sea, he gets out of the sack, he climbs up to a rock and he says, "The world is mine," before he ever goes and becomes the count or anything like that. It was so famous that the audience actually would say the line with him. They couldn't wait for him to say this line. He played this role over and over and over again. He toured it throughout the country for years, basically for the rest of his life. He tried to do some other things and nobody ever wanted to see him in anything else. They only wanted to see him in this, and it kind of made him go a little crazy. But O'Neill became so identified with the title role that he toured it in the United States, playing it over 6,000 times. That's a lot of times to play the same role over and over and over again. I did a show one time and we started rehearsing it in September, like when school started. Then we did the show in like November. Then we took it to contest. And then the whole next semester, we did it every Tuesday and Thursday for a bunch of kids. And then we did it again in the summer. And I was sick of it by then. I'm like, okay, I need to do something else. I can't imagine. I mean, that was maybe 50 performances, right? Total or something like that. I can't imagine doing it 6,000 times. His son's name was Eugene O'Neill, and he became a famous playwright. And he wrote a play about his father and about his years growing up. And it's called Long Day's Journey into Night. And it's based on his life. And it became an incredible bestseller. But Eugene O'Neill, the son, would not allow it to be published until after his death. And even then, he didn't want it to be published. He told his wife not to publish it, but something happened. It got published. And it was about how his father slowly went crazy because that's all he ever did. He was very famous. He was very successful, but it was just too much to keep doing it over and over and over and over and over again. Okay, melodrama. The basic plot of melodrama, there's a villain, again, hounded by a virtuous, a villain hounds a virtuous protagonist who overcame seemingly unsurmountable difficulties after undergoing a series of threats to life, reputation, or happiness. The morals of melodrama: good is threatened by evil with the eventual triumph of good. The major convention is the aside. This is something that was created, I won't say created during melodrama, but it was prevalent in all melodramas. We've already witnessed in Shakespeare, Hamlet talking to the audience. He's really talking to himself, right? The aside was you're acting, and then everybody on stage freezes, and one person turns to the audience and says, Gadzooks, could that be who I think it is? I think that's my long lost brother. And then goes back into the scene and starts acting again. And we as an audience understand that convention to mean everybody's on stage frozen. None of them have heard that. That is just what's going on in their head. And when they're talking to the audience, nobody on stage can actually hear that. So that was perfected in melodrama. That's the major convention that melodrama has added to the world of theater, is called the aside. They're looking aside and saying what they're going to say. And obviously we use it in all sorts of things now, right? Whenever anybody, even in film or television, looks straight at the camera and talks to you, you know that that's not something that the rest of the world is hearing. Okay. Uncle Tom's Cabin is another very famous melodrama. And in Uncle Tom's Cabin, Eliza is running away with her baby. The bloodhounds are chasing her. I believe it's been a long time, but I believe Eliza is part black, and the baby is mixed. And so they're after her. This is against the law. She shouldn't have done this. And she's running away. She's running on the ice on the river, and they have bloodhounds chasing her. So this is a very famous scene. And again, it was quite a spectacle in the theater to have the ice break off, Eliza and Henry, the baby, floating away to safety on the other side, and the dogs and everything chasing them. And it was quite a big climax. Okay. The set, theater changes. I'm not even sure what this means. 8 sets, the theater must change. This is all about Monte Cristo here. These are all different pictures from, they had 8 sets in the Count of Monte Cristo in the show, and they needed to be able to change the scenery. So again, remember I told you there was quite a bit of spectacle. Over here we have, Edmund getting up on the rock. The next one to the right is Edmund and his son in the last duel. I think that's the son standing over there in the corner, and it's maybe him dueling one of the other guys like Ferdinand, and that's the son. Over to the right, we have them throwing Edmund in the sack out the window into the sea. We have the jail cell where Edmund and the actual Count of Monte Cristo became friends, Faria, before he dies. We have Edmund going to Monte Cristo and finding the jewels and the fortune and everything. And then we have him, as a well-to-do man before he goes and exacts revenge on everyone. So there's at least 8 different set changes that needed to happen. So it was quite a big spectacle. Okay, the Booth Theater. You may have heard the name Edwin Booth. He's a famous actor, and he built a theater. Okay, the Booth Theater. O'Neill first played Monte Cristo at Booth's Theater there in New York. It was a big deal. Sorry, I had a dog tripping over there. It was a big deal, and because remember Edmund has to climb out of things, they had to kind of redo the whole theater and make it, there was no more raked stage. It had to be a flat stage. It had to have trap doors so he could climb up onto the rock, and they could throw him into the sea, and all these different special effects that had to happen. It was the first stage in modern times to have flat floor, no wings, and several areas for places to be removed to make a bridge opening across the entire stage so he could go into the water and stay in the water and then come up. So it was quite a big deal. Edmund's body, a dummy, was thrown off the bridge down below and fell, down to underneath the theater and stuff like that. And everyone, gasped as he was thrown. And of course, then he comes up through the water, like breathing, trying to breathe and swim. And everyone cheers. Um, by the way, you might recognize that name Booth. There was a guy named Booth who killed somebody in the theater. You might recognize that Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. Um, that was his brother, Edwin's brother. They were a very famous actor family, but it makes sense as to why he was in the theater to begin with. Um, and yeah, the one that killed Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, so they don't want to talk about, like, we don't want to talk about Bruno. They don't want to talk about it. So, um, so Edmund came up through the trap door to emerge onto the rock, for the world is mine. And again, everybody cheered. All right, so the show was so great, and now we have trains that can move us from city to city to city, so we can tour this show. They didn't tour shows really before this, but now we have locomotives to move us to all the different major cities, and we can do a show in every city. Then came sound films. Film had come out in the 1920s, but when the 1930s, so, we have melodramas, we have them touring through the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. And the 1930s came, we had at least one world war by then, and people weren't touring so much, and it was much easier to go to a movie. And because movies had sound in them, it was like going to a play, but it was up on a screen. So movies had started taking over, much the way movies, film, television, streaming has taken over now. People didn't go to the theater like they used to. Melodrama, though, so we had before electricity, we were starting to get electricity during melodrama time, but melodrama was also enhanced by gas lighting. So instead of having candles and oil lamps, they actually had gas lights where the gas was plumbed up through pipes up onto the stage, and they could make them hotter in intensity and cooler. So they could turn them up and down. And now we have lighting where we can adjust the lighting. We can make it look like nighttime. We can make it look like daytime. We can do all sorts of things because we have gas lights that can intensify and detensify rather than just candles or chandeliers or the open sky where you got what you got. So gas lighting had replaced all the candles and the oils during the first half of the 1800s. And these are gas lights along the side of a flat. I don't know if you can see that up and down the pole there. And this is a gas light up close, what it looks like. And again, they could turn more gas onto it, making it burn hotter and brighter. And then they could also turn it down. So they had control over lighting here. And that really helped with melodrama and the whole style of romanticism. The stage could be lit as brightly as desired. The gas table, this is what it looked like, where they could control the intensity. It was made possible through this gas table. So there was one person sitting back here that was turning all the knobs and making the gas, okay, turn off these and turn on these and turn off these and turn on these. And they didn't have headsets back then. They kind of had to listen to the play and know what was going on and be able to react, right? To just being off stage and hearing what was happening. Okay, you've heard of being in the limelight. Well, the limelight, it's called that because of a particular type of lighting instrument. Okay, the gas lighting created the limelight or the spotlight. And this is what it looks like kind of on the inside. Up here at the top where where the gas nozzle is pointing where it would be on fire, goes a piece of limestone. And when they turned the fire up on the limestone, it shone really super, super bright. And so it was all housed in this machine here. And so they made it really bright and they could shine it so it shined just on one person. And this is where we got our spotlight. And that's why people say, I want to be in the limelight. I want to be in the spotlight. That's what they're talking about. You put this blowtorch on the limestone. And here's kind of an example of it. That's a little piece of stone right there. And the blowtorch is on the limestone there. And I think this picture is actually being shot through a dark piece of glass, kind of like, what you were supposed to use when you looked up at the eclipse. It's kind of like when people, use, do welding and use torches and stuff like that. Yeah, you don't want to look at it directly because it's super hot and super bright. Okay, and it's housed in metal with a reflector and a lens that was focused on the stage. The melodrama, the era of a single play. So before melodrama, acting troupes performed a repertory of several plays. So they would know, we talked in Shakespeare's time that they would know several plays and they might do a different play every day or every week, but they were working on several plays at one time. Shows like the Mount of Monte Cristo, not the, I was going to say the Count of Monte Cristo. Shows like Monte Cristo were drawing particular actors to do that one play for very long runs. And that changed theater. So if Mr. O'Neill was doing this one show, people were coming to see just the one show. And they didn't want it to stop. They wanted to come see him again and again. And so the show would play for weeks and weeks at a time before moving on to another city. Or on Broadway, they wanted to come and see the same show. They didn't want the shows to change all the time. They wanted to come back and see the shows again and again. So it changed the way that theater does now. This is what we do. A bunch of actors just do one show. And then they might, stop doing that show and do a different show, but they don't do more than one show at the same time. Melodrama's influence. How did it influence us? Well, with melodrama, the theater in the 19th and early 20th centuries achieved its greatest mass appeal. And many of melodrama's features were adopted by mainstream filmmakers, particularly in action adventure movies, right? So we have a villain who puts our hero in a very precarious situation, who may be saved at the very last minute. That's born of melodrama. Okay, we do that in a lot of action adventure movies now. Charles Darwin. So why are we talking about Charles Darwin? So things changed in the late 19th century, so late 1800s, early 1900s. A lot of things, people started questioning a lot of things. And Charles Darwin wrote the book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. And his, of course, is the theory of evolution, that man did not come from just Adam and Eve, that man evolved over many, many years, and other species evolved over many years to become what we are today. And this threw people for a loop. Remember, up till now, most people are illiterate and don't read. And if they do read any book, the only book that they ever had was the Bible. So this kind of shook people's worlds. They talked about heredity and environment have enormous influence on human behavior. So the whole concept of, people are either, there's a big discussion of, when you're born, do you already have your personality and are you already predestined to do whatever it is you're going to do? Or does your environment help shape you to become the person that you are? In other words, if you were taken away from your family as a baby and put with another family in different circumstances, would you deep down in your root be a different person? So is it heredity? Were you born that way, or is it environment, the environment in which you were raised? So we're talking about how heredity and environment have an enormous influence on human behavior. And that the whole point is environment does help shape people, and society needs to accept some responsibility for the bad things that are happening in the world. So there's a bunch of poor people out around. Isn't it your responsibility to help stop the situation that made them poor? or to help them out? Or or is it also your responsibility for how people learn to do certain things? So, progress or change is a natural process involving trial and error towards improvement or refinement. And the Bible, at least in terms of dating the world and its creatures, is fallible if interpreted literally. This was again something that blew people's minds. If we actually looked and counted back the years that it said, how many years that, it was between, if you go, there's the book in the Bible that tells about how so and so reigned for 400 years and so reigned for, several hundred years. And then God said, I don't want man to live that long, so I'm going to cap it at 100. And then that's how, time was measured and stuff like that. But if you actually tried to count it and calculate it specifically only based on the works of the Bible, it wasn't going to come out right. And what do you mean we've been here for millions of years? There's no way that, this whole thing started millions and millions of years ago. So it kind of rocked people's worlds. And humanity is as fit for scientific study as any other species. Before this, again, we could study the evolution of mice or something like that. And now they're saying, no, we can study where people came from too. And people were shocked by this. So when things like this affect the world, they also reflect the arts, because arts are a reflection of what's going on in the world. That's why we talk about this here. Darwin proved that concepts of right and wrong might vary from one society to another rather than stand as absolutes. And melodrama was kind of built on the premise that human beings have an instinctive grasp of the difference of right and wrong. So Darwin kind of threw things for a loop there. It's, he said that, it depends on the society you're raised in, whether that is right or wrong. If you grow up in a society where, everyone always shares all the food all the time in the neighborhood, then if you go to your neighbor's garden and, pick their asparagus, you're not stealing. So, I'm making that up. But it kind of conflicted with the grasp of what melodrama says. It's either right or it's wrong, and there's nothing in between. Then there came Sigmund Freud, right around the same time. Okay, so he was born a little bit later, 1856 to 1939. And he's a little bit crazy and thinks that everything has to do with sex. But other than that, he theorized that our conscience is relative to the individual and the process of socialization. So what we think of as morally right and wrong, our conscience, depends on how much we socialize with other people and what we're taught in those situations. So socialization suppresses our instinctive desires and urges, because we might, see somebody with something that we want, and instead of going over and ripping it out of their hands, we know, because we've socialized and we understand how the world works, that that is not an appropriate thing to do. So we may never understand the motivations of other people's. We may never even understand our own motivations, but we know socially what's right and what's wrong. It's a social norm. When, someone says hello, you say hello back. When somebody has an ice cream cone and you really want an ice cream cone, you don't go and pull it out of their hand, right? At least I hope you don't. Okay, so we must be aware of the subtext, which is basically the meaning that we don't say out loud beneath what people say and do. You've met those kind of people that say, oh, have a nice day. Or maybe you said, oh, have a nice day, to someone that you really don't want to have a nice day because you're very upset at them. Like maybe they cut you off in traffic or something like that, or they were particularly snotty or something like that. So, we have to be aware of our subtext, what things actually mean beneath what's actually said or what's actually done. Okay, now we're moving on to realism and naturalism. So now that we have heredity and environment, and uh, it greatly influenced these movements of realism and naturalism, giving us to it's showing us more reflective of the way life really is, rather than the way that we want it to be, where good always wins and bad is always punished. So these concepts of heredity and environment are kind of grounded in the scientific outlook of the need to understand human behavior and in terms of cause and effect. Why does this happen? What caused this to happen? And how can we stop it from happening? Or how can we keep it continuing happening? So, in realism and naturalism, playwrights should only write about the society around them and do so objectively. In other words, don't sugarcoat things, don't make, happy endings just to have happy endings. Look at what life really is around you and try to reflect that. That's what realism and naturalism tried to do. Plays were written about contemporary subjects. They didn't write about historical things. They wrote about things that happened here, things that happen now during the time that they were writing. And plays portrayed behavior and social conditions not previously staged or thought of as fit for a public presentation. Um, there were things that you just didn't talk about in polite society. And all of a sudden, now they were putting these things out on the stage. People's dirty laundry, people having affairs and cheating on each other, and the realism of what was going on and how people were treated, how women were treated. And many of these plays dealt with poverty, disease, prostitution. Again, things that people didn't want to talk about in polite society. Now we're just putting them out there on the stage because they were real and because they were really happening. So, Henrik Ibsen, this is someone you're going to have to know. He is known as the father of realism. Okay. Sometimes he's also called the father of modern drama. And he wrote plays, realistic plays. The endings of his plays did not reaffirm the accepted values. The good people were not always rewarded, the bad people were not always punished, and things didn't always end up as nicely as they could have. And they ended up probably how they really were. Many of his plays were actually denied production because they were thought to be immoral and corrupting. He believed that women were victims of society. And at the time they were, right? He believed that at the time women couldn't vote, women couldn't own land, women, had these roles in life that they were expected to lead and were not allowed to do whatever they wanted to do. And so this is in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And when people are starting to think for themselves and go, wait a minute, maybe this isn't right. So, nevertheless, the plays were widely read, even if they weren't allowed to be produced. And they were discussed, especially because they were thought to challenge our moral values and our social norms. A Doll's House. So again, if we would have time, I would have you read A Doll's House, because A Doll's House is very important in that it was different. So the plot of A Doll's House. Nora, several years before this play happens, her husband was sick, very, very sick, like to the point of death. And the doctors weren't going to do anything for him if she couldn't pay for it. And so she wanted to borrow the money. Her father had left money in an estate, but the father had died, and there was no one to sign the money over to her. Her father had died like a week before, so she went ahead and forged his name, and so that she could pay for Torvald's health. because by law, she couldn't borrow money without her husband's consent. He was sick. He couldn't do anything. So now, this is several years later. He doesn't know anything about this. And he has just been appointed to be the director of the bank. It's a big deal. Krogstad is the one who lent her the money. And he was just fired from that bank. And he comes over to her house and says, hey, I'm going to tell on you, and you're going to be arrested because you forged your dad's name, and I know you forged it, and it was against the law for you to borrow money without your husband's consent, and he was sick, so he couldn't consent. And if you don't give me my job back at the bank, I'm going to tell and expose you. Nora is, of course, very upset about this, and she thinks that if she does tell Torvald what happened, that he's going to accept the blame for it and go to jail for her, to protect her because he loves her. So she thinks if Torvald finds out, he's going to assume responsibility for the crime, but it's going to ruin him. He's now finally arrived. He's the director of the bank, and he won't be able to get a job, and he certainly won't be the director of a bank anymore if he goes to jail. So instead, when she tells him, look, you've got to hire this guy back because I did this when you were sick to save your life. So instead he's like, oh my gosh, you are morally corrupt. I can't believe I have you in the house. As a matter of fact, not that he wants to kick her out of the house. He don't want to kick her out of the house, but he's not going to allow her to raise their 3 children because she is morally corrupt for doing this. And she's like, but I did it to save your life. He's like, it would have been better if I died. You are an immoral woman to break the law. And she's like, yeah, this doesn't all make sense to me. So Krogstad comes back and says, you know what? Never mind. I'm not going to expose you. One of their common friends, Christine, goes and talks to him, and he's like, never mind. I'll go find a job somewhere else. Torvald's very happy. He's like, whew, okay, good. All right. Well, then everything can go back to the way it was. And she's like, wait a minute. You told me you didn't want me to raise your children. Oh, yeah, that was before. No, everything's going to be all right now. And she's like, no, it's not all right. She feels alienated from her husband and alienated from society, and she decides to leave him and her children. It was a very scandalous act. Nobody could believe that she would actually leave her children. But she feels like, I can't accept the world as it is. This is absolutely crazy. And if I can't accept this, it doesn't make sense that society is like this. I need to go figure out society for myself. And you were going to kick me out for something that I did to save your life because I loved you, but I can't do that anymore. So I'm going to try to show you this little clip from the closed captioning just in case you can't hear it very well.
Something else has to happen first. I have to bring myself up. You're not the man to do that for me. I have to do that on my own. That's why I'm leaving you now. I have to be on my own if I am to get to understand myself and everything outside. That's why I can't stay here any longer.
No, you are.
I'm leaving straight away. I'm sure Christina will put me up for the night.
This is madness. You're out of your mind. I won't let you. I forbid it.
It's no use you forbidding me anything anymore. I'll take what belongs to me. I don't want anything of yours, either now or later.
This is madness.
Tomorrow I'll go home, to my old hometown, I mean. It should be easier for me to find something to do there.
You blind, inexperienced creature.
Don't you see that I get some experience, Torvald?
But you're leaving your home, your husband, and your children. And haven't you thought what people will say?
I can't think about that. I only know that it's necessary for me.
This is outrageous. You're betraying your most sacred duty.
What do you consider my most sacred duty to be?
Do I have to tell you? It's your duty to your husband and your children.
I have another duty just as sacred.
You have not. What could that be?
My duty to myself.
First and foremost, you are a wife and mother.
I don't believe that any longer. I believe that first and foremost, I am a human being, just as you are, or at least that I must try to become one. Oh, I know that most people will say that you're right, Torvald, and that it says something like that in all the books, but I can't go on accepting what people say and what it says in books. I have to think things out for myself so that I'll get to understand them.
Don't you understand that your place is in the home? I mean, don't you have something you can rely on for guidance in these matters? Religion.
Torvald, I don't really know at all what religion is.
What are you saying?
Well, I don't know anything except what Pastor Hansen told me when I was being confirmed. He said that religion was this and that and the other. When I get away from all this and on my own, I'm going to have to look into that as well. I must find out whether it was right what Pastor Hansen said, or rather, whether it was right for me.
If you haven't got your religion to guide you, then let me stir your conscience. I mean, you must have some moral sense, haven't you? Or perhaps you haven't. Answer me that.
Well, it isn't very easy to answer you that, Torvald, because I just don't know. I really don't know what I think about all that. All I do know is that you and I think quite differently about things like that. And now I'm told that the law is quite different from what I thought, but I simply can't get it into my head that the law can be right, that a woman doesn't have the right to spare her old and dying father or to save her husband's life. I simply don't believe that.
You think I talk like a child. You don't understand the society you live in.
No, I don't. But now I'm going to find out about it. I must find out who's right, society or me.
You're ill. You're feverish. You are out of your mind.
I've never felt so clear, so certain as I do tonight.
And you're leaving your husband and your children when you feel so clear and so certain.
Yes, I am.
There's only one explanation.
What's that?
Okay, so that's Nora. Yeah, so she was, that was quite scandalous. And people didn't know what to think. How could a woman leave her husband and her children? And yes, she had a nanny to take care of them, so it wasn't like she was, leaving them all alone. Back then, they did have people that did a lot of things for them. But the fact that a woman wanted to think for herself and try to find out if society was right, Ibsen was trying to make a point. So in A Doll's House, Nora faces the consequences of having forged her father's name to borrow money. The ending seemed like an attack on the family itself by considered the status of women and men as equals. And Mrs. Lind and Krogstad serve as contrast to Nora and Torvald. Mrs. Lind is her friend Christine, and unlike Nora, she kind of accepts her lot in life, and she wishes she had someone to look after. And Torvald is considered a pillar of society, and Krogstad is shunned by society as morally corrupt. Torvald embodies the accepted attitudes and the standards of his society at the time. And the fifth major character, who we don't really talk about, Dr. Rank, also serves as a contrast to Torvald. Nora feels like she can talk to Dr. Rank freely, but Dr. Rank is the victim of a congenitally inherited disease, syphilis. His mother had syphilis when he was born, and so he inherited syphilis. So he is kind of shunned by society, and these are things that you don't talk about. Syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease, is not something that you talked about. The play supports the basic assumption that character and behavior are determined largely by your heredity and your environmental forces. So what family you were born to, but also the environment that shapes you. And what each character is and does is explained by their background, by their upbringing, and their own experiences. And this could be changed into a melodrama by making Krogstad a villain and Nora a heroine. And, in the end, having her live happily ever after he withdraws the threat. But he doesn't do that. He leaves it messy, which is why this is typical of realism. It realistically shined a light on things that people otherwise wanted to keep in the dark. Another convention of realism is the box set. So A Doll's House uses one single setting throughout the play. Nothing changes. And it is basically the living room, drawing room of Nora's house. And they call it a box set because it's basically shaped like a box. There's a wall here, a wall here, a wall here, and then the audience is called the fourth wall. So if you took off a wall and looked into somebody's house, that's what the box set is. You would look like you're peering into somebody's, house or palace or whatever it is. But basically there are four walls, and the fourth wall is the wall to the audience. It's a realistic representation of an indoor space with all of the appropriate furnishings. There are coats and hats and flowers and dishes and everything done very realistically. It's not stylized. And actors were sought to behave as if they were if they were in real rooms. There's a sofa there and you're tired, you go and you sit on the sofa. You sit down on the chair, you would eat a cookie the way that you would eat a cookie. You would straighten out the tablecloth the way you would straighten out a tablecloth, as if it were a real room. The only difference is that the room is kind of tilted. We call it cheating out towards the audience, right? Where all of the chairs are facing towards the audience. And in a real room, you might not care how you were facing. The action, the character, and the environment are all intertwined. Now we go into naturalism and the difference between realism and naturalism. So there's a man named Emile Zola, and he developed the thought of naturalism. Okay, he wrote plays about naturalism, and it's kind of his deal. So unlike realism, naturalism, advocated by Emile Zola, had little success in the theater. Realism hit it really big. Naturalism took it a step further. Instead of it looking like it was outside, he wanted to make you really feel like you were outside. So he brought dirt in the theater and spread it all over the floors. He brought leaves, he brought junk, he brought trash. He wanted the theater not just to look like it did outside, but to smell it too and to feel it. And, he would go so far as to making the air stagnant so that it would feel like wherever he was trying to make it feel like. It was truth in art. We want things to look exactly how they look out there. They call it tranche de vie, or a slice of life. So naturalism, totally natural. We are going to make it, and it was about the real seedy side of life. It was like the lowest of the low. Let's talk about bums in the alleys and in the streets, and talk about the kind of really the things that we didn't want to talk about in public. As reality transferred to the stage, drama should demonstrate the inevitable laws of heredity and environment, and again, to the negative, to what we show as what happens in the seediest, dirtiest side of life. They emphasized the influence of poverty and other deprivations on the lower class. And they hoped that dramatists might expose all these social ills so that these causes could be corrected. If we show what these poor people are going through on the streets and show the squalor that they have to live in, then maybe everybody in the theater is going to do something socially so that these people don't have to live this way anymore. Not exactly sure what they were looking for, um, but it just kind of made people feel uncomfortable. And it didn't have the kind of story, the kind of climax and ending that made you think. It was just kind of there. And naturalism was eventually absorbed into realism. So there are some realists that took it a little bit to the naturalistic side, but they didn't quite go as extreme as naturalism went. The modern director also came out of these eras. In the past, the playwright or the lead actor kind of took on the role of the director. Back in Greek, we had the playwright, the one who wrote the play, was also the one that taught everybody the lines and kind of told everybody where to go. The directolos, and they were the ones that would tell everybody where things were supposed to be. Or maybe the lead actor would do this. But the 20th century plays, because we were going for realism, they needed to be more realistic. So we needed somebody to kind of stand back and look at it and make sure that it all looked right. Costumes needed to be accurate, as well as the lights and the sound. And now that we have electricity, we can make the daytime look like daytime and the nighttime look like nighttime. We can have sounds of crickets, at night. We can do all these different things. And so they really needed somebody to kind of guide it all and put it all together. Melodrama's effect kind of required split-second timing, because remember, they had like big technical events, right? Some big spectacular things, horses running on stage. So they had to have some precise timing. So we needed somebody to put it all together. And then the box sets, when we moved to realism, they kind of served to alter the movement patterns. So you wanted to look comfortable in the space, but again, you couldn't ever turn your back to the audience. So you need somebody from the outside looking in and doing these things. So these changes kind of required increased supervision, coordination, and rehearsal. The need for greater unity and control became increasingly evident. So the two major influences for the modern director, there are two people in the world that kind of we consider the first real directors, or the first people that influence real directing. One is Richard Wagner. And you might have heard of Wagner before as a musician. This is the same guy. And the second one is George II, the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen. Okay, Wagner, pronounced V, written with a W, pronounced V, Richard Wagner, he redid the way that theater seating takes place. So he wanted to create a master artwork through a fusion of all the arts. He liked using the sets and the people and the orchestra, and wanted to fuse it all together. And most of his stories for his operas are from German myths. So he wrote music, he wrote operas, but again, there was a lot of acting in these operas, and opera is not that different than theater. But most of the stories that he used to write his operas are from German myths. And he wanted to create a theatrical experience that would draw the audience out of its everyday, mundane existence into an idealized, communal, near religious experience. He wanted them to love the theater, to let it, flow through them, whether it be a happy or a sad piece. But he really wanted them to be immersed in the theater. And so he erected a new kind of theater in Bayreuth, Germany in 1876. And this is kind of a picture of it, where all the seating was the same. We don't have boxes, we don't have balcony, we don't have the gallery, we don't have a pit, but pretty much all of the seats are fairly the same. You still will have people that are closer or further, but the whole concept was so that everybody was more equal. And it was the first modern theater to do away with the box, pit, and gallery arrangement. It was democratic arrangement of seating, and all audience members sit together, even the king and queen sit with everybody else, in an arrangement that supposedly allowed everyone to see and hear the action equally well. And this arrangement kind of set the pattern for most 20th century theaters after that. So it was kind of a big deal. And he was really instrumental. Again, he not only was he wanting to direct all of the scenery and all of the acting and all of the singing, but also the experience that the audience had. George II, the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen, he had a fantastic theater troupe. He is now usually considered the first director in the modern sense, where he had control over everything that the actors did. And as a matter of fact, he would not let a play go on if he did not think it was ready. And his actors rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed to precision. And he had huge casts. He was the ruler of a small German state, and he was a duke, and he owned his own theater company. And his company was so well known and well thought about that he toured throughout Europe from 1874 to 1890. And everyone who saw the theatrical pieces aspired to be like him. They're like, everything was so well rehearsed and so well done. His fame kind of stemmed from the company's directorial practices. Saxe-Meiningen had complete control over every aspect of the production. This didn't really happen before, but if he said, no, I want the actors to enter in over here, I want the costumes to be like this, I want the lighting to be like this, he was the one telling everybody what to do, and kind of he was the ruler of the country, so everybody listened to him. And but the product was something spectacular. And the crowd scenes were staged with great precision, great variety, great emotional power. So like I said, it wasn't a small company of actors, but everything was staged very perfectly. And that's because he had control, and nope, nope, do it again, nope, nope. And there weren't a bunch of actors saying, no, 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 I want to come in over here. No, I want to do this first. No, let me do that. And like, you know, the strongest one winning or the loudest one or something like that. So the total stage picture was worked out moment by moment. Every hand wave, every leading over of the body, it was all precisely staged. And Saxe-Meiningen's practice validated many of Wagner's views. So I kind of went, yes, that's what I wanted to do too. So then came the independent theater movement. In the late 1880s, plays could not be produced for a public audience until they had been approved by a censor. Somebody had to read them and decide, yes, yes, you can do this play. But a private performance could be done for subscribing members. So if you subscribed and you were a member of the theater, then you could come see any shows that we want to do. And nobody has to approve it or not approve it. So everybody who paid to get in was a private member. The Theater Libre was one of the first ones that did this. Excuse me. It was founded in Paris in 1887 by André Antoine. Okay. He did realism and naturalism, and he directed like Saxe-Meiningen did. In 1889, the Freibühne was founded in Berlin with a similar situation. And then in 1891, the Independent Theater was established in London, doing Ibsen's Ghost in an enormous scandal. Because Ibsen, remember, he's the one that wrote A Dollhouse. He wrote about things people didn't want to talk about. Excuse me. Now we're going to talk about George Bernard Shaw. Excuse me. As he was a realistic writer during this time. He actually wrote some comedies. Over 8 out of 8,000 plays submitted to the British censor between 1895 and 1909, only 30 were banned. And 3 of those were by George Bernard Shaw. because George Bernard Shaw also talked about things people didn't want him to talk about. He had a play called Mrs. Warren's Profession. You can guess what Mrs. Warren did. She was a former prostitute, and this was one of them that was banned. And it was a comedy. And again, she's the prostitute with the heart of gold, and people love her. And no, that was censored, that was banned. He wasn't allowed to produce that show. But it was done in New York in 1905. And following the performance, there were warrants issued for the cast and crew for their arrest for quote unquote offending public decency because they did a show about prostitution. Shaw remarked, to prohibit the play is to protect the evil which the play exposes. Basically, it's showing that the way that the world exists, unfortunately, this woman felt like she had to be a prostitute because people weren't allowing her to have a legitimate job. And so if you don't see this, nothing's going to ever change. So if you're going to ban the play, that means that you're just trying to cover up the evil. That's the whole point of the play. Okay, the Moscow Art Theater is another place where realism bloomed. And it emerged from the independent theater movement. Again, so these are standalone places. You know, people could become members, and you could come and see the shows there. It was founded in 1898 by Konstantin Stanislavski and Vladimir Nemirovich Dichenko. Konstantin Stanislavski, you might recognize that name. He was one of the first people that is, he's the one that created the method for actors. So the Moscow Art Theater achieved its first major success with the plays of Anton Chekhov. I was actually in one of Anton Chekhov's plays called The Seagull. Most of his work was realism, and it was about Russia at the time, late 1800s and stuff like that. And so there was a lot of, it was domestic things that had to do with the country and that had to do with the people and stuff like that. And Chekhov, his plays depict the monotony and the frustrations of living in the provincial life. And his characters conceal as much as they reveal in their responses. So, there's a character that says, I am bored, 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 bored. Do we know she's bored? Yes. But we also see the underlying that she doesn't want to be bored and that she wants excitement in her life, and that, her life has been kind of downtrodden on her this far, and she was trying to get out from underneath it. So in a lot of the things they say, it's also what they don't say that really makes them special. So in his plays, the subtext, what's said underneath the lines, are as important as actual lines themselves. His plays admit a complexity of human beings and actions that don't easily conform to strict dramatic types. In other words, he didn't have any true villains or true heroes. People are messy, and they just are. And there's a lot of messiness that goes on. Go back. Okay. So this is Anton Chekhov, I believe, and this is one of his plays, and that's the Moscow Art Theater. And I don't know why it came out like that. The Stanislavski system. So Konstantin Stanislavski developed this system of acting, and it is the most pervasive influence of acting during the 20th century. It's one of the greatest contributions associated with the Moscow Art Theater. The Stanislavski system of acting contained several basic premises that are still considered the best known attempts to describe what's necessary for effective acting. So first of all, the actor has to train their body and their voice to be flexible so that they can respond to any of the demands that any role might put on them. And truthful acting requires that the actor be a skilled observer of human behavior. You have to be able to observe people and know how they really move and how they think and what motivates them, and to try to understand the relationship between the inner life and the external life. So we all do things and say things, and we might do things and say things differently. So I might get up and my back might be hurting. And, my son might ask me, "Hey, mom, how you feeling?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm fine." So we know that about people. We know that sometimes they cover things up that they're really feeling. And so if I'm playing a different character, I have to look at that character and see what is it that they're not saying? What is it that they're not telling people? And actors can project themselves onto somebody else into the world of the play through the magic if. And the magic if means if I were born where they were born, and if I were raised by the people who raised them, and in the area that they were raised, and in the circumstances that they were raised, how would I act truthfully in whatever the given circumstances are? So I take that character, I look at, was their mother mean to them? Did they have, siblings? Was there any rivalry? Were they an only child? Were they bored throughout their life? Were they raised in the country? Were they raised in the city? And I have to take all of these things into considerations. And the magic if I was born in that circumstance and raised like that, how would I act? So how would I act in this imaginary circumstance? And if I act truthfully as if I would have acted in those circumstances, that is what true acting is. It's behaving truthfully in imaginary circumstances. That's the magic if. Okay. Now we go on to symbolism. After realism and naturalism, we move on to symbolism. And symbolism is just like it sounds. It's symbolic of whatever the main theme is going on. That background, whatever that is, I'm not sure what play this is, is supposed to be a symbol for something, right? There's a rip in the fabric of reality. Things are not always as they seem. There's a big cut and blood's coming out of it. I'm not sure exactly what it is. This may be the crucible. It kind of looks like the crucible to me. But symbolism was the first artistic movement that actually rejects the traditional relationship between perception and representation. So first we had, we really don't care what kind of a backdrop we, perform in front of. Then we want it to look as realistic as possible. Then we want it to look like something crazy that doesn't even exist and the moon or something like that. So symbolism wanted to symbolize what was going on rather than show you, specifically what it was. It began in 1885, and it argued that truth transcends objective examination. Truth can only be hinted at through a network of symbols, and the symbols evoke feelings in the audience and states of mind. And that's going to be the only truth that we can actually get through these plays, is by evoking these senses, these feelings in the audience. Pelleas and Melisandre by Maurice Maeterlinck is perhaps the best known symbolist play. Okay, symbolism continued. Symbolists choose their subjects from the past, from the realms of fancy, or a mysterious present, right? They avoid any attempt to deal with any social problems. Okay, it's all symbolic. They don't want to deal with environmental forces. They're not looking at anything really real. They aim to suggest a universal truth, independent of time and place. And their dramas tend to be vague and mysterious and leave you kind of with a sense of going, what was that? And the answer is, you must determine it for yourself, because it might mean something different to many different people. Okay, The Symbolist theater, they established also independent theaters. They got the memo, right? And there was one called the Théâtre des Louvres in Paris in 1893, founded by Aurélien Marie Lupeaulx. The symbolist mood. The most important aspect of a symbolist production is the mood or the atmosphere that it creates, that it makes the audience feel. Often there is a scrim placed. This is an example here. If you can kind of look on the edges, you see that there is a piece of fabric that is placed in front of the actors, between the actors and the audience. So the action looks like it takes place in a mist or in a timeless void. So it doesn't really look real, but you can still kind of see what's going on. Color was chosen for mood rather than representational accuracy. So this could mean the dawning of a new day, or this could mean a growing anger between the two sets of people that are there or something. Sometimes now we have like huge pictures or huge projections up on screens above when there's actors performing below, and you're supposed to understand what's going on. Actors sometimes would chant lines or use very unnatural gestures or something to show this symbolism that they're performing for you. Symbolism confused audiences, to say the least. The performances were so different that many of the audience members were baffled, like they didn't understand what was going on. Remember, we talked about elitist drama back in the first chapter? The elitists were going, "Oh, that was beautiful." And the common people were going, "What just happened? What did I pay for?" They didn't really like it. So it kind of lost its appeal as a theatrical movement, but it remains the first non-realistic movement that's out there. Okay. People now tend to use some symbolic pieces in theatrical work, but it's not the whole thing. So sometimes people might use symbolic lighting or symbolic backgrounds, but the whole play isn't that. Because audiences didn't understand that the whole thing as a movement, but pieces of it can be broken down. Art for art's sake. This was another movement, and it was started by Walter Pater of English aestheticism. And it advocated that the only function of art was to intensify the experience and provide sensuous pleasure for the people. Oscar Wilde is the best known playwright and advocate. The Decay of Lying expresses the basic principles of the movement. Art must remain free from the concerns of time. And basically, instead of imitating life, life should imitate art, which is kind of a weird thought. But nature is raw material that is given to us. And okay, so we have this, art that we can imitate life with, but then we can improve on it a little bit. And therefore, it's imitating art. Lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art. That is a quote. Okay, this stance kind of breaks from the adherence to conventional standards. This picture to the right is from the play called The Portrait of Dorian Gray. I couldn't remember for a second. The Portrait of Dorian Gray. And basically in the story, as long as this portrait is kept in this guy's attic, he will never grow old. And eventually he's found out, the place catches on fire and burns down or something like that. The picture is destroyed and he turns old and dies. But basically that's kind of life imitating art was what the whole thought was behind it. Okay, Oscar Wilde also wrote The Importance of Being Ernest, which is the play that you are required to read for this section. It is quite funny, and I do hope you enjoy it. I'm going to break it down a little bit for you. Um, it's considered Wilde's comic masterpiece. It was written in 1895, and it makes use of the standard devices of the three-act, well-made play. It has carefully constructed exposition. So the exposition is where you expose all the things that are going on in the play. And so when you read it, you must pay very special attention to everything that's said in the first act of the play to understand what's going on for the rest of the play, because it gives a lot of background, and it's important, funny background. There are cause to effect arrangements of events. This happens, and therefore this happens, and therefore this happens. There's skillful manipulation of withheld information. There's a surprise ending. There's a startling reversals accompanied by last-minute revelations. And Wilde makes the inherent artifice of the formulaic pattern laughable evident. He uses stock characters to embody the action, and the artificial language and self-conscious style kind of resembles restoration comedy a little bit. So in The Importance of Being Ernest, the play begins in the London flat of Algernon Moncrief. Okay, so Algernon, he is a pretty well-to-do guy, and he invites his friend over, Mr. Ernest Worthing, and he wishes to marry Algernon's cousin Gwendolyn. But they find out while he's there, let's see, does it say this? Oh, that's Gwendolyn, okay. But he finds out, basically he gives him his cigarette box back that he left there before, and he says, but I don't think this is your cigarette box. He says, yes, of course it's my cigarette box. You've seen me with it 100 times. He says, but this says, Dear Uncle Jack from your little Cecily. And he says, okay, you caught me. My name's not really Ernest. My name's Jack. And he's like, what do you mean, Jack? Because I've always known you to be Ernest. And he goes, well, yeah, my name's really Jack, and I live in the country. And I have a ward. When the man who was raising me died, he left me his daughter to raise. And she's not really all that little. She's like 18. And at the time, 18 was perfect marrying age. And he's like, so, but Cecily is your ward. And he goes, right. And so when I come into the city, I kind of do things that I don't want them to know about in the country. So I created the persona of Ernest. And then I go back to the country and I can tell all the terrible things that Ernest did in the city, but he's my terrible, terrible brother, Ernest. He's like, but you don't really have a brother. He goes, no, I don't really have a brother. It's really me. And he says, aha, you're a Bunburyist. He says, what's a Bunburyist? Well, Algernon has created Bunbury, who is an invalid friend of his. And whenever he doesn't want to do anything, like when he wants to go to the country or when he wants to go somewhere and he has to explain to relations that he doesn't want to go to their dinner party, he says he has to go visit Bunbury. And he says, uh-huh, so you are just as bad as me. So Jack, who lives in the country, has told his ward, Cecily, who is, again, a young lady, and that about Ernest and all the scandalous things that Ernest has done. Okay? So that's kind of the setup here. Gwendolyn, Jack wants to marry Gwendolyn. Okay, and Gwendolyn says, oh, how wonderful. I've always wanted to marry a man named Ernest. And he's like, well, what if my name wasn't Ernest? And he's like, but it is. And that's been one of my dreams, is always to marry a man named Ernest. And he's like, uh-oh, what do I do now? So she's thrilled. She's going to marry him because his name is Ernest. Okay, and I believe I have a little scene for you here to watch.
The only really safe name is Ernest.
Gwendolyn, I must get christened at once. I mean, we must get married at once. There is no time to be lost.
Married, Mr. Worthing?
Well, surely. You know I love you, and you led me to believe, Miss Fairfax, you are not absolutely indifferent to me.
I adore you. But you have not proposed to me yet.
Oh.
Nothing has been said at all about marriage. The subject has not even been touched on.
Well, may I propose to you now?
Full opportunity. And to spare you any possible disappointment, Mr. Worthing, I think it's only fair to tell you quite frankly beforehand that I am fully determined to accept you.
Gwendolyn.
Yes, Mr. Worthing, what have you got to say to me?
You know what I've got to say to you.
Yes, but you don't say it.
Gwendolyn, will you marry me?
Of course I will. How long you have been about it. I'm afraid you've had very little experience in how to propose.
My own darling, I've never loved anyone in the world but you.
Oh, yes, but men often propose for practice. I know my brother Gerald does. All my girlfriends tell me so. Oh, what wonderful eyes you have, Ernest. Oh, they are quite wonderful. I hope you will always look at me just like that, especially when there are other people present.
Mr. Worthing, rise, sir, from this semi-recumbent posture. It's most indecorous.
Mamma, I must beg you to retire. This is no place for you. Besides, Mr. Worthing is not quite finished yet.
Finished what, may I ask?
I am engaged to Mr. Worthing, Mamma.
Pardon me, you are not engaged to anyone. When you do become engaged to someone, I or your father, should his health permit him, will inform you of the fact. An engagement should come on a young girl as a surprise. Pleasant or unpleasant, as the case may be. It is hardly a matter that she could be allowed to arrange for herself.
Okay, now I'm going to share another scene with you, a scene actually that follows that scene before, where Gwendolyn's mother is interviewing Ernest/Jack to see if he would be a suitable husband or not.
Gwendolyn! The carriage!
Yes, Mamma. You may take a seat, Mr. Worthing.
Thank you, Lady Bracknell. I prefer standing.
I feel bound to tell you, Mr. Worthing, that you are not down on my list of eligible young men. However, I am quite ready to enter your name should your answers be what a really affectionate mother requires. Do you smoke?
Well, yes, I must admit that I smoke.
I am glad to hear it. A gentleman should always have an occupation of some kind. There are far too many idle men in London as it is. How old are you?
29.
A very good age to be married at.
Thank you.
I have always been of the opinion that a man who desires to be married should know either everything or nothing. Which do you know?
Which do I know? I know nothing, Lady Bracknell, nothing.
I am pleased to hear it. I do not approve of anything that tampers with natural ignorance. Ignorance is like a delicate, exotic fruit. Touch it, and the bloom is gone. The whole theory of modern education is radically unsound. Fortunately, in England, at any rate, education produces no effect whatsoever. If it did, it would prove a serious danger to the upper classes and probably lead to acts of violence in Grosvenor Square. What is your income?
Between 7,000 and 8,000 a year.
In land or in investments?
In investments, chiefly.
That is satisfactory. What between the duties expected of one during one's lifetime and the duties exacted of one after one's death, land has ceased to be either a profit or a pleasure. It gives one position and prevents one from keeping it up. That's all that can be said about land.
I do own a country house with, of course, some land attached to it. About 1,500 acres, I believe. Of course, I don't rely on that for any of my real income. In fact, as far as I can make out, the poachers are the only ones who make anything out of it. Uh,
A country house? How many bedrooms does it have? Oh,
well,
no, that point can be cleared up afterwards. You do have a townhouse, I hope. A girl with a simple, unspoiled nature such as Gwendolyn's can hardly be regarded to reside in the country.
I do have a house at Belgrave Square.
Oh, what number at Belgrave Square?
149.
The unfashionable side. I thought there was something. However, that could easily be altered.
Do you mean the fashion or the side?
Well, both if necessary, I presume. What are your politics?
Oh, I'm afraid I really have none. I mean, I'm a liberal unionist.
Oh, they count as Tories. They dine with us or come in evenings at any rate. Now to minor matters. Are your parents living?
Well, I have lost both my parents, Lady Bracknell.
Ooh, to lose one parent, Mr. Worthing, may be regarded as misfortune. To lose both looks like carelessness.
Well,
Who was your father? He was evidently a man of some wealth.
I'm afraid that I really don't know. You see, when I said that I had lost both my parents, it would be near the truth to say that my parents seem to have lost me. I don't actually know who I am by birth. You see, I was found.
Found?
Yes. The late Mr. Thomas Cardew, an old gentleman of a very kind and charitable disposition, found me and gave me the name of Worthing because he happened to have a first-class ticket to Worthing in his pocket at the time. Worthing is a place in Sussex. It is a seaside resort.
Where did this charitable gentleman with a first-class ticket to that seaside resort find you?
In a handbag.
The bag?
Oh, yes, Lady Bracknell. I was in a handbag, a rather large black leather handbag with handles to it. An ordinary handbag, in fact.
In what locality did this Mr. James or Thomas Cardew come across this ordinary handbag?
In the cloakroom at Victoria Station. It was given to him in mistake for his own.
Cloakroom at Victoria Station?
Yes, the Brighton line.
The line is immaterial, Mr. Worthing. I confess, I feel somewhat bewildered by what you have just told me. To be born, or at any rate, bred in a handbag,
No.
whether it has handles or not, seems to me to display contempt for the ordinary decencies of family life. That reminds one of the worst excesses of the French Revolution. And I suppose you know what that unfortunate movement led to. As for the particular locality in which the handbag was found, a cloakroom at a railway station might serve to conceal a social indiscretion. Indeed, it has probably been used for that purposes before. Oh, but it could hardly be regarded as an assured basis for a good position in fact life. Oh.
Well, then, may I ask you then, what you would advise me to do? I need hardly say that I would do anything in the world to ensure Gwendolyn's happiness.
Well, I would strongly advise you, Mr. Worthing, to try and find some relations as soon as possible and to produce one parent of either sex before the marrying season is quite over.
Lady Bracknell, I don't see how I could possibly manage to do that. Well, I could produce the handbag at any moment. It is in my dressing room at home, and I really think that ought to satisfy you, Lady Bracknell.
Me, sir? What has it got to do with me? You would hardly ever dream that Lord Bracknell and I would allow our only daughter, a girl brought up with the utmost care, to marry into a cloak and form an alliance. Good day, Mr. Worthing.
So, with the importance of being earnest, you kind of get the idea. Wilde's use of language reveals the hypocritical attitudes and capricious behavior and twisted logic of his characters. The characters consistently value artifice over reality and appearance over substance. Act 2 is loaded with complications and discoveries. So Algernon, now that he knows that Jack is pretending to be Ernest in the city and has told Cecily that he's got a brother, Ernest, Algernon decides to show up at Jack's country estate and meet Cecily, pretending to be Ernest, pretending to be the long lost brother. And Worthing, Jack, he comes back and he's like, you know what? I'm going to kill off Ernest and that's going to be the end of it. I'm not going to be running around in the city anymore now that I'm getting married. This is too much for me. So he comes back and he tells Cecily that Ernest has died. And she's like, oh, no, he hasn't. As a matter of fact, he's here right now. What do you mean he's here right now? So Cecily also believes that the only suitable name for a husband must be Ernest. So she has actually fabricated this romance with Ernest before she ever met him. And as soon as she meets him, she lets him know, oh, yes, as a matter of fact, we are already engaged, because she had to, you know, plan the whole thing out in her head. And she comes off as a silly little girl. But now both Gwendolyn decides to show up at Jack's estate, and but Jack and Algernon go and argue, whatever. But Cecily still believes that he is Ernest, that Algernon is Ernest. Gwendolyn shows up to see Ernest, Jack, and comes in and meets Cecily. And they both talk about the fact and discover that they are both engaged to a man named Ernest. So here is that clip.
Miss Fairfax!
Allow me to introduce myself to you. My name is Cecily Cardew.
Cecily Cardew? What a very sweet name. Something tells me we're going to be great friends. I like you already more than I can say, and my first impressions of people are never wrong.
How nice of you to like me so much after we have only known each other for such a comparatively short time. Will you sit?
I may call you Cecily, may I not?
If you wish.
And you will always call me Gwendolyn, won't you?
With pleasure.
Then that is all quite settled, is it not?
I hope so.
Perhaps this might be a favorable opportunity for my mentioning who I am. My father is Lord Bracknell. You have never heard of Papa, I suppose?
I don't think so.
Outside the family circles, Papa, I am glad to say, is entirely unknown. I think that is quite as it should be. The home seems to me to be the proper sphere for the man, and certainly once a man begins to neglect his domestic duties, he becomes painfully effeminate, does he not? And I don't like that. It makes men so very attractive. Cecily, Mama, whose views on education are remarkably strict, has brought me up to be rather short-sighted. It is part of her system. So do you mind my looking at you through my glass?
Oh, no, not at all, Gwendolyn. In fact, I'm very fond of being looked at.
You are here on a short visit, I suppose?
No, I live here.
Really? Your mother, no doubt, or some female relative of advanced years, resides here also?
No, I have no mother, nor in fact any relations.
Indeed.
My guardian, along with the aid of Miss Prism, has the arduous task of looking after me.
Your guardian?
Yes, I am Mr. Worthing's ward.
Oh.
It is strange. He never mentioned to me that he had a ward. A secret of him. He grows more interesting hourly. I cannot say, however, that the news inspires me with feelings of unmixed delight.
I am very fond of you, Cecily. since I met you, but I feel bound to state that now that I know that you are Mr. Worthing's ward, I cannot help expressing a wish that you were, well, just a little older than you seem to be, and not quite so very alluring in appearance. In fact, if I may speak candidly.
But I do. I find that whenever one has anything unpleasant to say, one must always be candid.
Well, to speak with perfect candor, Cecily, I wish that you were fully 42 and more than usually plain for your age. Ernest has a strong and upright nature. He's the very soul of truth and honor. And if loyalty would be as impossible to him as deception. But even men of the noblest possible moral character are extremely susceptible to the influence of the physical charms of others. Modern, no less than ancient history provides us with many most painful examples of what I refer to. If it were not so indeed, history would be quite unreadable.
I beg your pardon, Gwendolyn. Did you say Ernest?
Yes.
Yes, but it is not Mr. Ernest Worthing who is my guardian. It is his brother, his elder brother.
Oh, it is strange. Ernest never mentioned to me that he had a brother.
I'm sorry to say that they have not been on good terms for a very long time.
Oh, that accounts for it. And now that I think of it, I have never heard any man mention his brother. The subject seems distasteful for most men. Cecily, you have lifted a load from my mind. I was growing almost anxious. It would have been terrible if any cloud had come across a friendship like ours, would it not? Of course, you are quite sure it is not Mr. Ernest Worthing who is your guardian.
Yes, I am quite sure. In fact, I am going to be his.
I beg your pardon?
Dearest Gwendolyn, it is no use making it a secret to you. Our little county newspaper is sure to chronicle the fact next month. Mr. Ernest Worthing and I are engaged to be married.
My dear Cecily, I think there is some error. Mr. Ernest Worthing is engaged to me. The announcement will appear in the Morning Post by Saturday at the latest.
Yes, well, I'm afraid you must be under just the slightest misconception. See, Ernest proposed to me exactly 5 minutes ago.
Oh, that is certainly very curious indeed, for he asked me to be his wife yesterday afternoon at 5:30. If you would care to verify the incident, pray do so. I never travel without my diary. One should always have something sensational to read on the train. I am so sorry if it is any disappointment to you, dear Cecily, but I'm afraid that I have the prior claim.
Well, it would distress me more than I can tell you, Gwendolyn, if it caused you any mental or physical anguish, but at the same time, I feel bound to point out that since Ernest proposed to you, he has clearly changed his mind.
If the poor boy has been entrapped into any foolish promise, I shall consider it my duty to rescue him at once and with a firm hand.
Well, whatever unfortunate entanglement my dear boy may have gotten himself into, I will never reproach him with it after we are married.
Do you allude to me, Miss Cardew, as an entanglement? You are presumptuous. On an occasion of this kind, it becomes more than a moral duty to speak one's mind. It becomes a pleasure.
You suggest, Miss Fairfax, that I entrapped Ernest into an engagement? How dare you? This is no time for wearing the shallow mask of manners. When I see a spade, I call it a spade.
Well, I am very glad to see that I have never seen a spade. It is obvious that our social spheres are vastly different.
Shall I tea here as usual, miss?
Yes, as usual.
Are there many interesting walks in the vicinity, Miss Cardew?
Oh, yes, a great many. Why, from one of the hills quite close, one can see 5 counties.
5 counties? I don't think I should like that. I hate crowds.
I suppose that is why you live in town.
Quite a well-kept garden this is, Miss Cardew.
Well, I am so glad that you like it, Miss Fairfax.
There are any flowers in the country.
Yes. See, flowers are as common here, Miss Fairfax, as people are in London.
Personally, I cannot understand how anybody manages to exist in the country. If anybody who is anybody does. The country always bores me to death.
Well, this is what the newspapers are calling agricultural depression, is it not? I hear the aristocracy are suffering from it very much just at present. I hear it is almost an epidemic among them. Would you care for some tea, Miss Fairfax?
Thank you. Detestable girl.
But I require tea. Sugar?
No, thank you. Sugar is not fashionable anymore.
Cake or bread and butter?
Bread and butter, please. Cake is rarely seen at the best houses nowadays.
Hand that to Miss Fairfax.
You have filled my tea with lumps of sugar. And though I asked most distinctly for bread and butter, you have given me cake. I am known for the extraordinary sweetness and the gentle disposition of my nature, but I warn you, Miss Cardew, you may go too far.
To save my poor, innocent, trusting boy from the machinations of another girl, there is no length to which I will not go.
The moment I met you, I distrusted you. I felt that you were false and deceitful. I am never deceived in such matters. My first impressions of people are invariably
Yes,
right.
well, it seems to me, Miss Fairfax, that I must be trespassing upon your valuable time. No doubt you have several other calls of a similar character to make all about the neighborhood.
A moment. May I ask if you are engaged to be married to this young lady?
Dear little Cecily? Well, of course not. Who could have put such an idea into your pretty little head?
Thank you. You may.
See, I knew there must be some slight error. Gwendolyn, the gentleman whose arm is at present around your waist is my dear guardian, Mr. John Worthing.
I beg your pardon.
This is Uncle Jack.
Jack!
Oh, here's Ernest.
I am,
A moment, Ernest. Might I ask if you are engaged to be married to this Young lady?
The white young lady. Oh, good heavens, Gwendolyn.
Yes, to good heavens, Gwendolyn.
Of course not. What should have put such an idea into your pretty little
Oh.
head?
Thank you.
I felt there was some slight error. The gentleman who is now embracing you is my cousin, Mr. Algernon Moncrief.
Algernon Moncrief. Is your name Algernon?
I cannot deny it.
Oh, is your name really John?
I could deny it if I liked. I could deny anything if I liked. But my name certainly is John. It's been John for years.
A gross deception has been practiced on the both of us.
You will call me sister, will you not?
Gwendolyn, a moment. But there is one question I think I should be allowed to ask my guardian.
An admirable idea. Mr. Worthing, there is just one question I would like to be permitted to put to you. Where is your brother Ernest? We are both engaged to be married to your brother Ernest, so it is a matter of some importance to us to know where your brother Ernest is at present.
Well, Cecily, it is very difficult for me to be forced to speak the truth. It is the first time in my life I have ever been reduced to such a painful position, and I'm really very inexperienced in doing anything of the kind. However, I will tell you quite frankly that I have no brother Ernest. I have no brother at all. I never had a brother, and I have not the smallest intention of ever having a brother in the future.
No brother at all.
No.
I'm afraid it is quite clear, dear Cecily, that neither of us is engaged to be married to anyone.
No, it is not a very pleasant position for a young girl to suddenly find herself in.
Okay, so you have just seen Cecily believing that Ernest is the only suitable name from the husband. Algernon comes in. Cecily and Gwendolyn both think that they are engaged to Ernest. Both men show up and reveal that basically there is no Ernest. And so the next scene is Jack and Algernon's muffin scene. I will let you guys go back to the PowerPoint and look at it because this is getting kind of long. But if you would like to, you can go back and look at the scene. And basically, after the girls leave them, they sit there and argue and eat muffins. And both of them have an appointment with the clergyman to go and be christened by the name of Ernest. In Act 3, it reaches a climax. Cecily's governess, Miss Prism, is discovered to be the nanny who lost the baby in a handbag. Lady Bracknell comes and says, I recognize you, Miss Prism. There was a baby and you went away and never brought it back. And she had a play that she was working on, a manuscript, and accidentally put the manuscript into the baby carriage, the pram or pramatur or whatever they called it. Basically, it's a stroller, and put the baby in the handbag and accidentally left the baby at the station. So she's a bit of a ditz, right? Jack Worthing goes and says, wait a minute, are you talking about this handbag? And Lady Bracknell says, yes. Yeah, or Miss Prism says, yes, that's my handbag. And he's like, this is the handbag that I was found in. And they figure out that Jack is actually the nephew of Lady Bracknell, which makes him Algernon's brother. So it's revealed that he's the child of Lady Bracknell's sister and is therefore Algernon's older brother. And they look up to see what his real name is, and his real name is actually Ernest. And the characters' lies have now become their truths. And in this way, art reflects life, reflects art, reflects life. So that's Oscar Wilde. And then there's another little scene here if you'd like to watch it. And the play supports his essential critical instance, his stance that life imitates art. Okay. And that is the end of that. That's the end of chapter 6 and the importance of being earnest. And we are going to be back for the next one later. So thank you very much. As always, if you have any questions, let me know.